our next speaker here, the next big disruption in mining. It's not tech, says Tiffany. Maybe she would give a little bit of thought to AI at some point, but really at the end of the day, she's got a really interesting argument here that talks about the real risk, what is happening inside your workforce. So Tiffany, first of all, thank you for joining us from out in Alberta. It's wonderful to have you. Always great to speak with you. Her firm specializes in workplace culture, resilience, and inclusive innovation. Her organization is called Beyond Diversity, and she has lived experience in Canada's resource extraction sector, my apologies, and she brings a rare blend of frontline insight and executive strategy. And once we get talking, you'll see what I mean. Tiffany is such a sharp thinker as well as such a compassionate and strong, resilient human being. So I'm going to tee up your first question here, Tiffany. Welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you to everyone in the audience, whether you're joining us live or in the recording. I want to just point out one thing really quickly before we dive into
Sure.
my conversation. And I mean, right through from Amanda to Emily, Catherine, Cheryl, everyone has said a couple of words that I just want to point out to the audience that's really important. Agility, resilience, and future ready. Whether we're talking about humans or whether we're talking about machines or whether we're talking about, our 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 ability to manage tariffs and all of these critical supply chain issues, those topics and those larger themes are resonating through all of the work that we're doing. And this is really exciting because I think what that shows is that we are ready for systems that are for the future. We're done with the past. We're ready to move forward. So I think it's absolutely fantastic to have so many thought leaders. And thank you, Artemis, for bringing us all together today. I
Oh
had
my
to throw
gosh.
it in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love it. I mean, I'm a little bit of a change nerd. I love thinking about change and how we can take, driving into the ditch, let's turn it into an innovation, right? Let's figure out how to fly out
Absolutely.
of the ditch. Let's not just get back on the same road that we were on before, right? Like, seriously, it's almost a cliche, right? To talk about disruption and how it's actually a gift. And I don't know if there's anyone on the call that's just going, don't tell me it's a gift. I just hate where I'm at right now. Very, very important to acknowledge that, right? Change can be painful. It can be scary. This chaos and uncertainty, our brains, our nervous systems register that as a threat. And there's so much we can't control, right? So that can feel, I think, just to acknowledge from a human systems perspective, this is really hard. It can feel really, really
Absolutely.
challenging from a physical and mental point of view. And so
Yeah,
thinking about things like commodity prices, market volatility, things happening with our suppliers that we just have no idea. We don't know until they
absolutely.
can't send us the next shipment. And then are we in a shutdown position? My gosh, these are all very real, very challenging things that are going on right now. Tiffany, though, you have another take on what the real risk is, or what you perceive as the most important risk right now, which is inside the workforce. So
Absolutely.
unpack that for us, please. Not that it's a competition, by the way, but your area of expertise obviously is thinking about what's going on with the people and how we can really utilize that in the same way we were just talking about with the other changes. How can we make this into an opportunity, but maybe we first need to understand our current state. Where are we at right now, and what are the risks here as you perceive them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of those things where it's a yes and. So we talk about
Mm-hmm.
all the external factors that we're throwing all of our resources and energy into: climate change, tariffs, supply chain issues, financial issues, all of that is very real and it does require attention. However, what is almost being skipped over is the impact of all of those things. And Erica, you and I just touched on it internally within the organization. So, what we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot within many mining companies, oil and gas companies, and several other industries is high turnover. We've had an increase in safety incidents. I know that there's a number of mining companies that are very concerned about this. We
Yeah.
have leaders and even employees that are burnt out. They are barely hanging on. And it's because of all of these external pressures. And I mean, I'll go back to what Cheryl said, we're not doing maintenance on ourselves. So Our
Mm.
culture requires attention. Our culture requires work. Um, we measure all of these other external performance factors. We're not measuring what's happening inside our organization. And Heather asked this question earlier, and I'm so glad she brought it up, is how do we find out when these things are starting to go wrong before they become a critical issue, before we have a fatality, before we have the turnover being so high, we're losing millions of dollars a year. And there's lots that we can look at within our organizations. Now, again, this is going to require some shift in thinking. It's going to require some shift in the systems that we work with because we need to measure things just a little bit differently. We're going to be looking for things like a lack of pride within the organization. We want to make sure that employees, and this takes like listening on the edge is what I call it. So we want to make sure that whatever's happening within the organization, we have a pulse. And we're going to be looking for a language shift, kind of going back to what Catherine said, how critical that language is. We're going to see an increase in sick leave. We're going to see a very low uptick on EAP programs or mental health supports because it's not safe for anybody to come forward in that particular culture. We're going to see an increase in conflict, but we're not going to see the resolution. So we're going to see more grievances in union situations, more reports to managers about, interpersonal conflict within in teams, breakdowns in that trust system. We're going to see an increase in resignations. It's so true. When people have had enough, they've had enough. And the data is starting to show us that we are actually moving into a time where people are not quitting for money anymore. We've heard lots of stories of people being offered, significant raises to move in organizations and they'll stay. Our values sets have changed since COVID, so it's really important that we take a look at that. And then repeat of minor incidents along with the major incidents. Safety is that triangle. The more of those minor incidents you have on the bottom, the more chance that you're going to get to that peak incident or potentially that fatality. So I think
Yeah.
that, that communication gaps and all of those things, if you're looking on the edge, you will be able to see all of this coming, and be able to do the things that we need to do to stop it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about reading the minor incidents and knowing that those are just as important as the major incidents because they paint that overall picture
They
of what's
do.
going on in the organization. And it occurs to me as you're describing this whole situation where you've got conflict, you've got people checking out, you've got a language shift that's, indicating that people don't feel safe and they don't really want to be there. Maybe they're kind of checked out even though they're still showing up,
Yeah,
or there's more absenteeism, those types of things. Sometimes we struggle to measure that. We
exactly.
don't necessarily have one metric or data that says this is the health of the organization or this is what's going on. In fact, these are the things that don't even go into quarterly reports.
Nope.
It's the story. You talked about listening around the edges. So it sounds like that is the type of work that you are really a specialist in. You can read the room at that level, so to speak, whether it's on the front lines or at the regional office or in the mine site or in the corporate office to understand what's going on there. And I guess I'll
Absolutely.
say, like maybe to transition to the next question, I guess a lot of the time we hear these external factors. Oh, well, it's the labor market. We just don't have enough people graduating from mining, which is true, by the way. But maybe we're
Yeah.
also saying, oh, these Gen Zs, they just work in a different way. Like there are these external things that
Yeah.
we might be tempted to sort of deflect or attribute, maybe
Yeah.
put the blame on that to say, well, that's what's causing our problem. So what would you say to that conversation and how would you maybe redirect leaders to consider something else?
Yeah, and I think historically, I would say yes. Historically, they were likely right. But we're looking at a different future. We're looking at a different generational workforce. We're looking at a different value system in society overall. And what that translates to is the same data does not translate the same way. So when we look at, like an increase in turnover, in the past, and I just talked about this, the data showed that people would leave for money, they would leave for benefits, like there's some perk, or I can get to a vice president or a president position faster. Those were historical reasons for leaving. High turnover now means something completely different. It means that they're not in a
Mm.
safe environment. We've shifted our values from a capitalistic view into a more connected view. We want human connection. We want value. We want, all of those things that matter have changed. And I honestly, in all of the things that I've looked at, I really do believe that it was this COVID pandemic that shifted our value system. We were shown front and center the things in our lives that matter. And coming out of that, people are doubled down on their commitment to those things. So when we're looking at this and when leaders are looking at the data, I think what we need to do is to look at it from a different perspective. Now, what that also means is that we need to ensure that our organizations have the ability to bring those voices to the table. It is so critically important that we listen to all of the voices. You want the squeaky wheel, you want the one that doesn't agree, you want the ones that aren't just nodding and smiling. It is so important. The scatterbrained woman that you think doesn't have an intelligent thing to say, who really just has ADHD, like those neurodivergent people who think
Wow.
completely different. There is so many perspectives that are now required as we transition. We're in the messy middle. The past isn't working and we haven't figured out our future yet. So how do we move our organizations through that? And that requires everybody at the table. So for leaders, yes, continue to look at the data. It is extremely important, but look at it from a different perspective. And when you're looking at the outcomes and the meaning behind it, ask more questions, dig in a little bit. What does this mean? And what does it mean in correlation with the other data that you're getting? Because that's really where some of the story is told.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, what I hear you articulating, Tiffany, is such a powerful way of seeing, because the data points, maybe they're there. It's just knowing how to connect them instead of saying, well, this is one thing and this is another thing. Some of these are really hard topics to talk about. And maybe that's another thing to think about from that mind leader's perspective. If they hear that harassment is happening
Yeah.
or violence on site, maybe women that don't feel safe in camps, those types of things, there's silence. They can't get people to talk about it, so maybe they don't have data or survey
Hmm.
responses, but we know these things happening. And so in the
Yeah.
absence of data, we might be tempted to just leave it alone, right? But what you're saying is that it's actually kind of dangerous to ignore and pretend that those things don't happen, because
Absolutely.
there's
We
stuff
know.
happening there.
I've
Yeah.
talked to enough HR professionals, director level and down, that say like, oh, we know things are happening, but we don't have the data. My advice is stop looking for the data because the lack of data is the data. Like that is the data point.
Mm.
The fact that you do not have data is a wild red flag into what's happening within your organization. From my own personal experience, did I report the sexual harassment that I had experienced on site? No. No, I didn't.
Yeah,
Why? Because it wasn't safe to do so. The systems
exactly.
that we currently have set up, really, they rip women out of their careers and things like they're not conducive to being able to continue on with a career. And that's not at the fault of anybody. It's just an antiquated system that we have to work forward with and we have to change. But that does start with having the conversations. I work a lot with gender-based violence with organizations. They are tough conversations. They're uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
But the organizations that are brave enough to dig into that create really safe, and I mean like physically safe, psychologically safe, and really empathetic cultures. Um, we do a lot of work in building that empathy within organizations between workmates, between leaders and their teams, between leaders themselves. We're changing the conversation, and I think it's really important that we recognize those that are courageous enough to do it and recognize that it requires a level of courage to step into it. It's not easy. It's not fun, and there's no handbook. It's kind of like being a parent. Like you're thrown this wild problem and there's safety involved and there's all of these things, but you have no rules because the rules that we used before don't work. So what does that look like
Mm,
moving forward? We're going to create our own rules for it. So anyone that's actually been brave enough to step into that space, thank you. We see you. And
yes.
for those that are thinking about it, yeah, it's really scary. Um, Humanity's on the line, right? So that there's a bigger cost and a bigger risk.
Thank you for framing that. I love what you said about it's not your fault. I think that that is sometimes just such a foundational message that leaders, the people in charge, need to really really internalize to feel their own sense of safety so they can find their own bravery and their own courage to say, this stops here, not on my watch. Like, this will be the
Absolutely.
last time that these incidents happen because we're really going to do something about this.
Absolutely.
Not another survey, not another maybe mandatory training, right? It's going to be something that is
Absolutely.
deeper, that is harder. It's more tender,
Yeah.
right? It brings up all those vulnerabilities, but it really is worthwhile. And I heard on one of the International Day of Women in Mining panels yesterday, one of the male leaders shared some of the things that they had done at his site. And he said, I have daughters and I want them to know that I'm doing what I can to build a world that is safer for them and for all women. And I wanted to get up out of my chair and clap for him. And it's also not necessary to have daughters to be part of this conversation. That is sometimes,
Absolutely.
do you hear
Yeah.
that a lot from mining leaders? They have this
A
sort of
ton.
awakening when they recognize their own children are going to live into this world
Yeah.
and be part of these
Yeah. I do.
companies
I
and
hear it
systems.
all the time. And I think too, like, I I'm going to pause this just for a second. I know we're talking about women in mining right now, but I also need to recognize something. And Cheryl really did a good job at this, like this macho miner, giving us a picture of what that looks like. And I need to acknowledge that there are men that are working in mining that have also been silenced because they don't fit that picture. But society, again, like that antiquated view, those systems have told us that they are the ATM machines of families. They're not allowed to cry when their kid is sick. Like they're not allowed to go
Mm,
home because they're the ones that are supposed to be holding down the fort. So, like the
sure.
systems that we have in place right now don't work for anybody, So having,
Mm,
men step up as, looking to be our allies is so important in this work because it's about creating a system moving forward that is good for everybody. And when we do that, we bring in all genders, all races, all cultures, all of the people then belong. And I think that that's, really the goal here. We talk a lot about gender because it has been, and especially in mining, we haven't done a good job at including people. But moving forward, we will do a better job. And, them stepping forward and being brave enough to say, oh, for my daughters is also, if you listen on the edge, you'll hear them saying it's also for me. Because they can use their daughters as, like that's their buffer. Like we talk about being able to go to the playground and play on the swings
yes.
because our kids are, like really it's us that want to. But, it's the same thing when we have these men, especially in senior leadership with families. We've told them they have to be all of that in a bag of chips and they have to be strong. And when they have daughters, they're allowed to open up their heart a little bit. So we get to see a little bit of
Mm,
insight with their daughters leading the way for them. So I think that there's lots of messages that we can hear as long as we just sit back and listen. Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful. I can see how there is such a personal journey. There's so much meaning and so much depth and so much emotion in what you're sharing as well. Tiffany, I, I want to wrap up here. I don't want to wrap up. We're going to wrap up and move to the next speaker, but I would just love to invite anyone in the audience who is connected, who is curious about what Tiffany is suggesting. She's really giving you a different sort of playbook, a way to listen what's going on around the edges, to connect the dots of what's going on in your organization in a different way. Because if you want to be part of the solution, you're going to want to bring a different solution to the table, right? And we don't want to pretend that the chaos isn't there, that people aren't hurting and needing more connection and needing more support and needing better systems to protect them and make sure that they're well on the job. And I think Tiffany could be a great thought partner for you if you're interested in that conversation. I know she has some great solutions, including a brand new offer called Uncharted to share.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Tiffany.
much, Erica. And thank you for everyone on the call today. I really appreciate your time.